one of my major points in framing the problem was that I don't believe we can solve this problem by confronting the existing structure. And that's exactly the same insight that Buckminster Fuller had. I think what we have to do, if I could use a football terminology, is to make an end run around the current structure and create an alternative on the ground, even on a very small scale. So that at least we can say there is an alternative. Remember back in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher's favorite comment was, there is no alternative. And just the fact that we could show on a very small scale that there might be an alternative would be a world-shaking event. And that's what I want to talk a bit about. So a plan of action, that's what we want to do now. Let me first start maybe with some general comments. We have to replace neoliberal economics with something else. And what I'm suggesting is something which I call Gaian economics. Gaian economics really consists of two things: an economic philosophy and institutions which are necessary in order to implement that philosophy. And this is very important to understand, because in my opinion we cannot simply introduce ecological economics with the existing structures. I hope that was clear from my introductory comments about the way the WTO, IMF, and World Bank are working. They are designed specifically for exploitation. They're not designed to create the kind of world that we want. So they have to be replaced. So we have to have a new economic system which puts ecology first, sustainability first, survival first, and everything else subsidiary, including the economic system, jobs, growth, everything else must come in the secondary way. And we need to have new institutions to make this work in practice. So what I'd like to start with is kind of an ideal solution. If we just could imagine a future global society which was long-term sustainable and democratic, with the freedoms that we have being accustomed to, how would it look in the ideal sense? And one conclusion I come to is that there's one area where we have to have international cooperation if we're going to survive as a species, and that is the area of sustainability. The area of having some kind of central power that can assure that on a global level that the necessary environmental protection laws are in place and they're enforceable. But at the same time, in this society, it's important that we do it the right way. We don't want a totalitarian system that enforces sustainability upon us. We want it to do it with respect for human rights. Okay? So that's a fundamental premise of my solution, is that the one thing we have to see in terms of sovereignty is environmental protection directives and human rights directives to some central organization. Everything else in this model, I'm saying, can be decentralized. Foreign policy, what kind of economic system we want. So let's imagine we could have a world of maybe hundreds of sovereign countries, hopefully small, but certainly in the short run they won't all be small. And each one of them has complete charge of its own economy and its own priorities. So that we have kind of like, just as in nature, many, many different cultures, many different systems. This approach is not ideological. I'm not saying that this system is going to be capitalistic or socialist or anything else. In my view, we could have many different kinds of societies at the individual level of the nation state, as long as they accept the fact that they have to cede sovereignty in these two areas, and at the same time respect the rights of other countries to make their own priorities also. This is my ideal world, if you like. You may or may not agree, but that is, I think, a good starting point, which is not ideological, which simply is focusing on long-term survival. So how do we go about doing this? Well, I have outlined in my book a number of new institutions which would have to be implemented. If we're going to introduce ecological economics as the top line, and that's what I'm suggesting, that whatever organization we make, it's going to have to be based on ecological economics. By the way, ecological economics is, although it's not widely known, is actually a well-defined branch in economics. It hasn't got much funding because it's not really accepted by the mainstream economists as relevant. Mainstream economists do not recognize limits to growth of any kind. They assume that if a resource runs out, there will always be another one available, maybe at a slightly higher cost, but they will never run out. And as Herman Daly and other ecological economists have pointed out, that this assumption actually is in conflict with a fundamental rule of physics, the second law of thermodynamics, where it certainly states that energy moves in one direction only, from a very concentrated form to a dissipated form. And once you've used your resource and your energy, it's gone forever. You can't use energy twice. And so there's a fundamental error, a flaw, if you like, in traditional economics in that regard. So state policy has to be ecological economics. One of the first things we have to do is have a new kind of trade organization. If we want to have these individual nation states having control of their economies, then we have to reverse the neoliberal idea that there is the free flow of capital and the free flow of goods. This is fundamental. It means taking back control. The way it is today, under the existing structures, foreign commercial interests have much greater control over your local economy than the citizens. We've given away our sovereignty. Back in 1994, 1995, with the WTO, many countries adopted membership to the WTO without even realizing that they were giving away the most important part of their sovereignty. The trade rules that you adopt in a country are probably the single most important factor that affects everything in your society. And so by taking back control, and saying we can put on tariffs or on any product, we can prevent any particular company, any particular country, any product coming in if we don't want them. You can't do that today. So it is a form of protectionism, but it's a positive kind of protectionism because it's protection of your environment and it's a protection of your cultural priorities. So trade organization with no further flow of free flow of goods or capital. A second institution I'm suggesting is, I call it a clearing union. This is actually an idea which was first put forward by John Maynard Keynes back in 1945 in the Bretton Woods negotiations. And it was based on the idea that international trade can be settled without having to actually use a currency. You can do it, it's something similar to this LET system, which was mentioned in Greece recently. So rather than actually exchanging currencies, you do a debit-credit system. So one nation is credited, the other is debited in a central credit union. And as long as your surplus or deficit on trade is within an acceptable bounds, then things will just go on indefinitely. If they get to the point where your surplus or your deficit is hitting a maximum allowed, then penalties kick in. And this was Keynes' idea, was that we should have a system which gives equal rights to both creditor and debitor nations. But the current system under neoliberal economics gives all the rights almost to the creditors, to the banking system. So I believe that we could revive Keynes' idea there and have a new kind of way of settling international trade, which would not only be a fairer system because no single currency anymore would dominate, but even the dollar, if the Americans wanted to buy oil, for example, they would have to use foreign currencies to purchase it, and they couldn't use dollars as they can today in unlimited amounts. So that would even the playing field. I'm also for proposing a new kind of development. The current development model basically, as I mentioned, is based on exploitation of the developing countries. They're not being allowed to develop. I'm suggesting that we could have a new system. These first two organizations, the credit union, or the clearing union, and the new trade organization, both have the effect of freeing up a lot of foreign currency reserves in central banks around the world. Because once you don't allow the free flow of investment capital, you don't need as much in your reserves. And once you go to a system of a clearing union, you don't need all these currency reserves. So this would free up a lot of capital particularly in the developing countries, to use to create a new development bank, if you like, that which would promote real development, which means enabling these countries to start producing their essential goods themselves, becoming self-sufficient in food and energy and so forth. All things that they're not allowed to do today. Then I have one I call a Congress. We have to have some kind of a legislative body in this organization. I am assuming here in my model that these are government appointees, so that every member of a state appoints representatives, and together they can pass resolutions. And the resolutions which they pass would be, by definition, international law for the member states. This too is a very significant step forward, because we don't have any accepted international law today. That's enforceable. At least we have some various international courts and so forth, but their decrees are often ignored, especially by the major powers. And of course, we have to have a court of justice to interpret the law and decide on reasonable penalties for non-compliance. We have a commission. The commission is basically an executive which would be responsible for managing these various institutions, like the trade organization and so forth. And then we have a couple of rather novel ideas. One I call the resource board. Remember now that this organization I'm talking about is only authority in two areas. It's human rights and it's environmental protection. So this resource board would be the place where these directives would be put out to the member countries, which would assure that the environmental protection laws are complied with. This is a bit similar to what the EU actually does today. They issue environmental directives to member states. So it's in principle, it's something similar to that. I give in my book an example of one of the first things that I think such an organization should do is to implement a sort of a cap and trade system for controlling carbon dioxide emissions. So that we said, globally speaking, we have a maximum which is allowed, and any company which wants to introduce fossil fuel burning into the economy would have to purchase these permissions, which would be a limited number available each year and declining each year, so that we can put a stopper to the increase in temperature. And once we have such a system in place, the really good result of this is that we have a higher price on CO2 emissions, which means that the private sector will now have an incentive to innovate and to develop new technologies which are using a more efficient in terms of CO2 emission production. And this is the key. In fact, many business people are saying the same thing. I know the largest energy company in Denmark, Dong, for example, has said directly to the politicians, give us a high price on CO2 so we can know where we stand, so we can make long-term investments. You know, a lot of these companies are making investments which are 20, 30 years into the future. They have to have some assurance that the parameters are going to be there. So this is an important point to realize too. You know, I'm not anti-business. In fact, I spent my entire career in the private sector. And some people think because I'm talking about this corporatocracy in the United States, that somehow it's the corporations who are somehow the evil people. That's not the case. In fact, I think most businessmen would be very much in favor of such a system as this, on one condition, that the same rules apply to their competitors. Then they say, fine. But the problem is, in the current system, we can't do that. These structures, like the WTO in particular, they're preventing that from happening. So in this, I believe a lot of business people would actually back up on this proposal. Then the final new institution I'm proposing is, I call it a council. And the reason for this is an elected body, as opposed to the Congress, which is government appointees. And the reason I'm suggesting this is to introduce a democratic element in the structure, in the centralized structure. Of course, every individual member state will have its own way of organizing, its own democracy. I think most of them would probably choose democracy, but they needn't necessarily do so. these individuals, nation states, might be socialist, they might be capitalist, they might be religious. As long as they maintain the restrictions put upon them by the central organization, they can do what they like. That's in my model at least. So, but there's one problem with this structure. If we didn't have such a council, what would prevent some group within the government appointees of different countries getting together and couping the Congress and taking control and passing resolutions which maybe are not in the general interest, but maybe in the interest of that group, which happens, you know, in most ordinary parliaments. And here's why I'm saying that we should have a council of very high integrity people, a small number, elected from different Earth regions, maybe only 7 to 10 order of magnitude, who are very high integrity people who have demonstrated throughout their lives that they have the integrity and they have the track record to show that they are truly interested in the interests of the entire planet and not just in a particular region or a particular religion and so forth. And I believe that every culture actually has such persons and they know well who they are. Here in Norway, for example, I could say a man like Eric Damme, who I just met just the other day. That's the type of person. A person like Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Prize here recently. A person like Nelson Mandela. You know, there are many people in many different cultures who I would have no problem in saying I trust these people would make the right decisions. And what I'm saying that this council should have is one formal power only, and that is to veto any resolution adopted in the Congress. And in this way, keep the total direction of the entire civilization on the right track. And also to prevent any particular group from taking power and moving it in the wrong direction. But besides this, I envisage they would also, on a day-to-day basis and a month-to-month basis, also be available to do mediation of various kinds. If there was a conflict between regions or nations, they could be called upon, if they were requested to do so, to suggest a solution, either a binding or non-binding. So they could have this function of sort of having an ongoing finger on the pulse of what's happening around the world. And if such a council existed, I believe most problems would be cut off in the bud before they became so large that there's a possibility of actually armed conflict. So if we're fortunate, a structure like this, I think, would reduce drastically the possibility of war in the long term. And I'll also say that one of the big problems we have today in terms of conflict is that when you have a system with many different sizes of countries, some very small and some very large, it's very unstable because the large countries are always thinking, well, I'm more important, you know, I should have more influence and so on. And this is what often is the basis for these kinds of conflicts. So I would hope that a system like this might result in the very long term, and we're talking very long term here, maybe 100, 200 years, I don't know. But some of these larger states we have today, which are holdovers from developments in the last few centuries, may break down. And so that countries like USA, China, and maybe even Europe might break down into many smaller countries. I think a country like Norway and Denmark are about the right size for this kind of model. I'd like to have a lot more of that size. So this is what happened here. Something happened. Oh, sorry, something's bothering me here. Maybe I could have my technician come up and help me. Well, anyway, you can see this. So this is, if you like, my suggestion, how do we get there? First of all, I'd like to make the point that if you're going to form a new global organization, you don't start out by negotiating with 193 countries around the table. Any large organization which has ever been developed, like the League of Nations, the United Nations, the EU, always started with a small group of maybe only 6 or 7 countries who got together, made a first draft of a charter, and said, we're going to adopt this, and then invited others to join. And this is the way I think it should happen also. And so the first task of these founding nations then is to break away from the WTO. This is why I call it the breakaway strategy, because that is the one institution where there are binding regulations. We can still be members of the United Nations, of the World Bank, and of the IMF, because these are all voluntary organizations. By the way, a lot of people often ask me about the United Nations. Couldn't we use the United Nations to form such an organization? And if you think about it for a minute, I think it should become clear that you cannot do it that way. There's simply too many members. It's impossible to reach any kind of compromise. You have to have a small group which takes the leadership here. What I call leadership by example. But actually saying, we're going to do this. We're going to actually form an organization. I call it the Gaian League. A small organization of maybe only 6, 7 countries. We say, we're going to adopt ecological economics as our state policy, and we're going to develop a plan for transition, and we're going to put the economic system as a subsidiary to the needs of the environment. And perhaps most important of all, you're all welcome to join, because this is being presented not as an organization that will benefit the members, the founding members, but it is put forward as a proposal that in principle could be a solution for the entire 6, 7 billion people, however many we are. So they have to leave the WTO and form this Gaian League. So now I'd like to discuss a little bit the question of who should take the initiative here. And I think perhaps the most likely solution is that some of the smaller developing countries might be the most likely candidates. Countries like Costa Rica, perhaps Bhutan, which is the only country that has ever rejected GNP and said, let's have a different kind of index that actually measures well-being, gross national happiness. And there are other smaller countries that I think have a high degree of awareness of these issues that might very well be interested in taking on such an initiative. And also some of the smaller industrialized countries, possibly. For example, a country like Iceland. Why not? Norway, New Zealand. There are some of the countries I mentioned that are smaller industrialized countries. Ideally, we should have a good spread initially between geography, level of technology. We want to call some high-tech advanced countries and some perhaps lower-tech agricultural countries. Because in the long run, we have to be a very diverse group of countries. And remember that the point I made earlier that there's no way that the developing countries today are ever going to achieve a level of consumption that we know here in the West. It's impossible due to the ecological problems of overload. And so any solution is likely to have a very, very diverse kind of membership. But that's okay. I mean, that's the way nature is. And as long as everyone respects everyone else's rights, then it should work. So what about the EU? You know, in many ways, the EU would be the ideal region to take the lead, because the EU has already showed over many, many years how we can cooperate together. But there are some problems with the EU. First of all, the EU still gives top priority to economic growth. They talk a lot about the needs for sustainability, but when it comes down to a clash, it's always the economic growth that wins out. And one of the reasons for that is, as I pointed out earlier, the influence of the corporate sector. Because if they don't follow that rule, they run into this problem that the corporations say, well, we can't compete. You know, so you have this dilemma. So as long as the EU has this policy, it's going to be difficult. Also, the EU does not allow individual countries to implement controls on capital flow, which I think is absolutely necessary if you're going to cut off the influence of these non-member states who are still neoliberal. You have to keep them out. And also with regard to the flow of goods, you have to take control. Unless you want to give that control to foreign corporations. And this is not allowed in the EU. How are we doing on time? Okay. But on the other hand, the EU has this fantastic potential. If they did take the leadership, I'm sure that many, many other countries, particularly many developing countries, would follow. If the only EU could see the opportunity that's in front of them, if they actually took the leadership on this. But unfortunately, I don't think it's likely to happen. Unless, and this is an interesting question, unless the current crisis really gets much worse. And I think there's a good possibility that that'll happen. I mentioned also in the book that the euro was right from the beginning was a disaster, just waiting to happen. It should never have been started up. You cannot have a common currency in countries which are so diverse in their structure, in their culture, in their history. I mean, it was completely predictable. I said also in an article back in 2000 when the Danes were voting on whether to join or not, that this currency may not even last 10 years. Let's keep out. And right now, I think that's the only long-term solution is basically for it to break up and for every country to go back to its national currencies. I don't think that's going to happen in the near future. I think they will struggle along and do what they can to solve the problems the way they're doing it. But the only stable long-term solution, I think, is a breakup. Maybe a few countries might adopt the euro and continue to carry on, while the others go back to their national currencies. In that situation, I think it's conceivable that the EU leadership might just see the light and say, maybe it's time that we did the things the citizens want instead of the things that the elite politicians want. Because now, for 50 years, basically, since it started, it's been driven by the vision of a few very idealistic politicians, but where we consistently have had resistance coming from ordinary citizens who don't want a United States of Europe, who want to have their control over their own countries and their own cultures. So that's why I'm saying there's a question mark with the EU. If we're lucky, it might happen that way. As was pointed out by the previous presentation, sometimes a crisis can be what's necessary to really create radical change, also in a positive direction. So in this chart here, I have asked the question about Norway, because here in my book I mentioned 12 countries that in one way or another may have the right characteristics to be founding members of such a Gaian League. Split them up by region. In South America, Bolivia, Venezuela, Costa Rica. In Africa, Senegal, Tunisia, and Mauritius. In Europe, in Asia, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Bhutan, the Maldives. And then some of these smaller industrial countries like Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, New Zealand. I'm sure there are many other countries that could be imagined, and who knows, once this idea gets out, there may be some surprises. And so one of the questions we're going to look at later today, I think, is the question of Norway. Is Norway a potential candidate for a founding member? It would be fantastic if Norway could see its interest in taking the lead on this and being part of it. So it's not just some of the smaller developing countries. And I think Norway, in many ways, has the consciousness about the need for sustainability and the consciousness about human rights and democracy that would be a very, very important ingredient in such an organization right from the very beginning. And of course, with the tremendous oil reserves that we have here in Norway, that would also be a very, very powerful tool to have within its organization, because then it would make it much clearer how we could use, for example, the idea of the clearing union and the new kind of trade organization to begin to use that oil in a very constructive way, and not just use it to improve the standards of living here locally. So that's a subject for this afternoon. yeah, so I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say about solutions, and I hope that you might get some inspiration from the ideas here. I have no idea whether it's going to be possible to do this in practice, but I personally can't see any better way to make the attempt. And if some of these smaller countries can get together, I think they could demonstrate the idea that leading by example can actually lead to success and can create the kind of energy that will get others to join. And it could also be an example of how three different sectors could work together. The one being some of these smaller countries who are outside the influence of the neoliberal system, the civil society, all these NGOs and other citizens who want to see radical change. And thirdly, the more progressive parts of the business community, who, as I said, I believe also could back up on this idea. And so the idea of expanding, once you have the initial, let's say, 7-member guiding league, is that the non-member states, in the non-member states, the civil society and the progressive business community could put pressure now on the political leadership. And even in the USA, tremendous pressure could be put upon the corporatocracy from below by groups saying, we need to consider joining this organization. They stand for everything that we claim to stand for. Sustainability, human rights, democracy, freedom. Why are we not a member? This is a very powerful argument. Not only that, but most of the initiatives that we've seen to date from the civil society have been basically single issue campaigns, like Save the Rainforest, 350.org, Friends of the Earth, all these are great organizations. But one of the problems is it's so difficult to get them to unite behind a single proposal. And here this could happen. This could happen because if we say that here's an existing organization which is actually doing something for the good of the entire planet, we should be backing them up. And so we say, let's have a referendum, let's have a vote. And the entire civil society and a good part of the business community could then force the issue and say, you have to have a referendum. That's the strategy. Okay, thank you.